Neil Basu. So interesting. I've got him back for a second time. And we're going to talk about Neil's book, Turmoil, 30 Years of Policing, Politics and Prejudice. And for those who can see on the video, I'm just holding the book up, and a thoroughly good read. And as you know, as a dyslexic, I've been listening to it. And I've actually been listening to it for a second time. And there's a whole wealth of things that Neil and I are now going to talk about. It's like the unexpurgated version of a really good conversation between two friends, because Neil has become a friend, and those 300 pages are unputdownable, if I use my awful Yorkshire language. Neil, welcome back.
Well, thank you for inviting me back, Jonathan. It's incredibly flattering, and thank you for saying what you said about the book. I appreciate it. I've done that incredibly cheesy thing, and I've got it sitting.
Oh yes, you got it on the back,
just below the Metropolitan Police Bobby Bear. I always used to take the mickey out of people who did this for the book, and because it's going to be my only book, I thought I might as well have a go. So.
I like that. I like it very much. It's for those listening. It's on his bookshelf with a Metropolitan Police Bobby Bear stuck up the top. Well, let's go. Firstly, this book, Turmoil. Why did you write the book, Neil? Who is it for, and what was the purpose behind it?
Well, I had three very clear reasons for writing the book. I mean, the one that's really closest to my heart is I wrote it for my children because, their mother and I split up when they were very, very young. And I wanted to try and give them an understanding of what I was doing when I wasn't parenting them. And I've always carried an incredible amount of shame and guilt for that, the breaking up of their family, and I've always stayed very close to them. I have a very, very close relationship with them now, but it's been very difficult, and I wanted them to understand. So this was, when I'm long gone, my father never had the opportunity to download his head to me so that I would have a memoir, and you can pay people to do that for you these days. I wish I'd done that, So that was a really personal reason for doing it. The second reason was, this is my love letter to policing. And I want policing to understand that. I mean, I've had some feedback. There are police officers who are not going to take this well in some respects. I talk a lot about institutional racism. That was a major driver for writing the book, where we are post Stephen Lawrence from 1999. But principally for me, I mean, I loved the job. It's the most important job in civil society. It's the thing that keeps us all safe. You can't do anything else unless you feel safe. Unless the police is as good as it can possibly be, that is a dramatic problem for society. And of course, when I left, it was straight after Wayne Couzens and David Carrick, two monsters in uniform who worked for the Metropolitan Police, actually worked in one of my commands, who had been arrested and charged and put away for just some of the most heinous crimes you can possibly imagine, the murder of Sarah Everard and the multiple rape of many women. And we'd lost the confidence of women and girls. Dame Louise Casey, a friend of mine who wrote the most damning report on the Metropolitan Police since Stephen Lawrence in 1999 from William Macpherson. I had to read that as one of her critical friends before she published it, and I walked away from Camden Town Hall in tears that I had wasted 30 years of my life. And I thought, I've got to put down how I feel about policing. So this is it. And when people say, "Would you do it again?" Then I've had people say, "Well, you wouldn't encourage anyone of colour to join, would you?" I said, "I'd do it again tomorrow, if I was 25." I'm too exhausted at nearly 60 to do it. But it's a job for people with gas in the tank, but it's an important job. And lastly, because I wanted people to understand the people we are behind the badge. We do such a difficult job where you're permanently in conflict. I mean, mostly people do not want to have any engagement with the police, but you do want to feel safe that they're there when you would need them. You want to have trust and confidence in them. I think it's important to understand that they're just human beings behind the badge. And if you can read this book and understand what it might do to somebody who went from a beat Bobby as a police constable all the way to assistant commissioner, imagine what the job is doing to our frontline officers who are working earlys, lates and nights for 30 and now with pension changes for 40 years. Imagine what it's doing to them and what it's doing to their families, the families they leave behind when they're putting complete strangers' families before their own, which is a frequent thing, which you either have a family who can stomach that and support it even if they don't like it and understand that it's not simply a job, it's a vocation, or you split up. And that is it's a brutal truth of the job.
Well, thank you for the reason why. I think in everything we do, it's really important we understand why. Everybody can cope with the what and how if they've got a clear burning
Yeah.
why, and you had a clear burning why in writing the book. I found it really profound, incredibly well written, and very open, very vulnerable of you to do that. I really felt like I was on the journey with you. We're going to talk about that. Particularly, always just like right from the beginning, in being with a father who was from India and a mother who was Welsh and white. You are described as a person of color, but you always were going to call the book, what was it, the whitest of
The
them?
whitest one.
The whitest
It's
one.
one of my very good friends, a young female sergeant in the Metropolitan Police. I was telling her the story of the commandant at Hendon Training School wanting a person of colour for the front cover of a brochure, and that I was the acceptable face of colour at Hendon at the time. There were only a few of us in an intake of over 300 people, and who's that? is that almost scared me out of my chair, and I'm good around dogs. So the black man, the turban wearing Sikh, and the Indian woman were not acceptable to this person, but I was, and I couldn't really understand why. And certainly my instructor, who was asked to ask me to do the photograph, was horrified that I might even consider it. Her name was Farida Holderness. She was an amazing person. She was one of the first, I think she was the first female Asian sergeant in the Metropolitan Police. So you can imagine her being asked that question and thinking, if he does this as the token darkie, I will be horrified. And I did it anyway. And I was telling that story to my mentee, and she just said, "Oh my God, you were the whitest one." And I thought, what a great book title. What a great book title that would have been. And that's partly I use the expression you and I are very familiar with from the military, fit in or F off. That is a kind of, I don't want to swear on your podcast, but the fit in or F off thing is a kind of, well, if you learn to absorb the culture around you and fit into that culture, you're going to have much more chance of being successful and not being hurt. And of course, I grew up in all white communities as a mixed race boy, learning how to fit in as a matter of survival. So it becomes sort of second nature as you grow up. But the whitest one was, I mean, I know she likes me, but it was both very funny and incredibly cutting at the same time, because if I thought you have to compromise yourself to do that, that's a terrible thing. But as I told Farida at the time, if somebody joins the Metropolitan Police because they've seen me on the front cover, or just joins any police force and they're a person of colour, I will have done my job. And I won't know to this day whether anyone ever did. But I hope they saw my career, and I know people have joined and have stayed because I was in that position. And so it's important. It's important to have thick skin if you've got dark skin, is my expression.
Wow, yeah. And I think you will have been such a role model to so many people. And let's hope you continue to be so. And I think by being open and honest about the challenges, people don't go in blind. Because I think it's a bit like we do a great disservice to our children if we tell them, "Darling, don't worry, you came last. Here's a medal for coming last, and this is fine. You're going to be great. You're the best ever."
I don't think that is a good thing to do.
I don't think it's going to help them. And just equally saying, "Don't worry, it's going to be so easy doing this exam. You're going to breeze it," and then they fail it, and then they can't understand it. I think we have to be honest without crushing people. We have to. Expectation theory is a very interesting one. Whether you expect someone to succeed or not, that they're likely to live up to that expectation. There's a whole load of work done that. So people can achieve great things if you believe in them. But at the same time, I recognize in a very different way, as a middle-class lad coming from a grammar school, joining the Scots Guards, who were upper-class, Eton and Harrow educated officers, I felt I tried to fit in. And it's a completely different thing, I know.
However, do you know what? I don't think it is a completely different thing. It's a class, social mobility, colour, and any protected characteristic is just one characteristic. When I sit in rooms and I talk about diversity and inclusive leadership, and everybody in the room who has a protected characteristic, whether they're female, from a working class poor background, who's joined a graduate profession, whether they're neurodiverse, whether they're gay, whether they're black or Asian, it doesn't matter. They're all nodding furiously because their outcome is exactly the same. The journey to get there is slightly different, the way they are. And I think it's bullying. I think all the isms we talk about are just symptoms of the real disease, and the real disease is bullying. We
Yeah.
join cultures, and cultures bully you to fit in. And we
Yeah.
have to build people's resilience when they're young to understand that. My parents told me, you better be twice as good as everyone else to get noticed and never make a mistake because they won't let you fail. That sounds really brutal. I mean, I'm sure they put it in a much nicer way at the time because I was very young. But I did grow up with that understanding that that's what it would take. And your
Yeah.
point about opening people's eyes so they don't go in blind is that's what it takes. Whether you like it or not, if you're female, black, Asian, neurodiverse, or that's what it takes. Now, you need people around you to support you and give you the resilience to be able to cope with that. If you can't, you just give up on day one.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the key word is resilience without putting on too much of a mask. Because in some ways, you and I, in different ways, have had to put a mask on to fit in rather than
Yeah,
F off
yeah,
with that environment, whether it be, upper class guards officers or airborne training where you got to be super macho and tough and don't show any weakness. You put on or even just going to boarding school and you put on this mask that you're not crying and you're upset and you're fine. So interesting. Now, I also want to celebrate that by the time this goes out, you'll be doing your podcast for a while, but you're just about, in a week or two's time, to start The Crime Agents, where you and Andy Hughes, who's an investigative journalist, Geordie from used to be Sky, and now he's on LBC. You're all being sponsored by Global, and I'm really looking forward to the two of you discussing a variety of things like the news agents on crime.
I
Tell us a
can't
bit about
wait.
that. Tell us a bit about
Well,
that.
it's
What's it going to be about?
the news agents created it. So Lewis Goodall, John Sopel and Emily Maitlis are our kind of parent podcast. They won't appreciate that. I'm older than two of them, so they won't appreciate me calling them my parents. But there's the sports agents, and now there's the crime agents, and it's
Yeah.
been advertised this morning. We're speaking today on the 18th of June, and the first trailer has gone out this morning, and it'll be launched in a week's time. So hopefully by the time this goes out, I will be a regular weekly podcaster. Let's see how it goes, but I cannot wait
Yes.
because I thought when I retired and I wrote this book as a cathartic kind of release of retiring, Nina, my wife, looked at me and said, "Well, that's it. That's enough policing now. You just get on with the rest of your life." And I sat there for the last 2.5 years thinking, but I don't know anything else, and no one's really interested in me talking about anything else. This is what I know and I love. But you
Yeah.
end up just shouting at the radio and the television and the newsprint, which is people making 6-second judgments on a really, really complicated set of issues. Politicians making incredibly controversial populist statements without understanding the consequences or the constitutional position of what they do. This is a chance to talk about some of those issues in real depth and from the point of view of both victim and investigator. I think it's a kind of I'm hoping people are interested in crime. I know that. I mean, true crime sells by the bucket load. Unfortunately, not so much crime memoirs, but we'll see. But but I think it's an important subject for the public, particularly where
Yeah.
confidence in policing and the criminal justice system is. So I'm looking forward to it, and thank you for mentioning
Well,
it.
it's gonna be on my favourite list, and I recommend it to those listening. The Crime Agents. Da 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 da. Anyway, policing. Lovely quote you said in the book, as I read it. It's not just a job; it's the job. Tell us about that.
Well, it is. That's what we've always called it. So there was an in-house magazine called The Job for many years, capital
Yeah.
T. It isn't a job; it is the job, and it's not a job at all. It is a vocation. It's so much more than a job. So the title is ironic. And because my father was a doctor and my mother was a nurse, and I figured out very quickly I wasn't going to be a banker or a salesperson. That the sheer sort of selfishness of those careers was killing me, and I thought, my God, I've got these amazing role models who I've been looking at my whole life. Why am I not doing that? My brother's a doctor, my little brother keeps our lights on as a director at the National Grid, and there's me trying to make money from selling money. I mean, what a useless profession that is, And my second job selling chocolate, okay, I quite like that. But nevertheless, this was such an important thing to do. And I understood vocation from my parents and where that leads you. I mean, unfortunately, it does lead you to workaholism, but it is, there's nothing better than getting out of bed, doing something you love is probably the greatest thing in life.
Yeah, and I think there is a strong link because we've become good friends. I think this is sort of the basis of it, really. My 20 years service in the military and your 30 years in policing, the vocation, the calling Dharma, if we use the Hindu word of the
Yeah.
journey that you're on.
Thank you for using
It
that
really
word, as
is.
the son of a
Yeah,
Hindu.
I know, and I'm married into a Hindu family, so I'm really getting all the full immersion with Sandeep Sunny, my son-in-law, and his family, which is great. Yeah, there's this idea of a calling, a vocation, doing it for a higher purpose, a reason why. Of course, we'll get the toxic ones in any organization of the size we have. You'll get, like in something as God-fearing as Roman Catholicism, you get perverts and you get pedophiles getting attracted to that because they can prey on people, and
Yeah.
this is going to happen. But let's come back to role models to you, your mother and your father, and they met through the medical profession. Father was a police surgeon, very proud, always telling people, "My son's one of you guys," and but he was had such a positive impact on you, your father. His dedication to work right until he became ill with 3 terminal illnesses, and how crushing it was for you when he did die. Do you want to just talk a bit about father and that moment when he finally went and you
Yeah.
realized the legacy he'd left you?
There's quite an interesting thing about my dad, because my dad was a practicing Hindu, and I didn't realize that till I was in my 30s. I know that sounds ridiculous, but my dad was also a bad Hindu in some respects, because he emigrated here in 1961, and one of his favorite things was the traditional Sunday roast. And he couldn't help but think, well, I quite like this beef. So I've spoken to some Hindu clerics about this in the past, and they said, "Don't worry, we accept all sorts. Some of us are lapsed, and some of us are." But he was very, very devout in his understanding, and he believed in one God, not the thousands of gods that some Hindus believe in, but he believed in one God. But Hinduism was at the forefront of who he was, and he was a very quiet, unassuming man. Tremendous strength, inner strength. So he turned the cheek to all the kind of abuse he suffered. I mean, he went to his grave without telling his children anything about how difficult his life was, not least marrying a white woman from a very small town in North Wales, and how they were treated, how he was treated by the National Health Service as a very young Indian senior registrar who couldn't get a consultant's job because he was Asian. Did my father ever once say that or complain about it? No, he didn't. He just got on with building a career and a life for his family. So when I look at that and the comment that he made to me that we've already discussed, you kind of understood why he was so important. And because I think I heard my father raise his voice twice in the whole time I knew him. And he was just an extraordinary man. And my greatest regret when he died was that we didn't have enough time. He spent the last year virtually unable to talk, bedridden, suffering, a terrible, terrible decline. He was lucky. My mother was a nurse, and she looked after him 24/7 for the last year of his life. She wouldn't have help. She did it herself, nearly hospitalized herself in the process. An incredible, incredible woman, and my other great hero. But he didn't have a chance to tell us all the things I wanted to talk to him about. So sitting by his bedside, telling him how proud I was of him, knowing that one of the last contracts he gave up as a doctor was police surgeon, because he just liked talking about me to all those poor custody staff, sergeants in Staffordshire must be bored as hell of listening to the Metropolitan Police officer that was his son. But I think he was so proud of me, and he didn't live to see me get my medal. He didn't live to see me become assistant commissioner and the head of counter-terrorism. And I so wanted him by my side when that happened. And he's still a
Well,
huge hole in my life.
yeah, and also remember that you have had many years with him. So, for example,
Yes.
my father was killed age 33 when I was 2.5. And I had so long wanted to have conversations with him. And there was one particular exercise called the Mankind Project, where they role play people being who you were in your family. And they did an incredibly powerful role play, having been briefed by me about my father, my mother, and all that went on, where I went to my father's graveside and they pulled back the shroud and I had a conversation with my father, who then spoke back to me. It's called the Father's Blessing, about what he's appreciated about my life and what I've done with my life and the mistakes I've made and the highs and the lows. that was one of the most profound moments of my life. Now, in your own way, even though he couldn't speak back, you were able throughout much of your life to talk to your father, to see him, and he saw so much of your career. Yes, he didn't see the Queen's Police Medal, which is a huge achievement, and other aspects where he could have told you more of his life. And yet still, you had the opportunity to pick up his qualities and his characteristics, which I see in you, which is why I've invited you back for a second time, because these three things, the three hums, humility, humanity, and humor, are something that it seeps through your skin. And this is why you are
thank you for
truly
saying
an
that,
inspiring
because
leader.
you have absolutely described my father there. And he wasn't a perfect man. You know, my mother would be the first to say he could be infuriating at times, and he definitely wore the trousers, even though that wasn't apparent to us. We always thought it was our mother. But he made the decisions in our house, and he wasn't a perfect man, but those three words encapsulate him perfectly. So thank you for saying that about me. That means a lot.
Well, I really genuinely mean it. And I think the other thing is the imperfection. And that comes across in Turmoil, 30 years of policing, politics, and prejudice. Time and again, you talk about the mistakes you made. I mean, there was a lovely one. What was it you said? I was being quiet when I should have spoken up. Shame on me. You know, I was tired, pissed off, and I decided to speak up about the murder of George Floyd. And I think throughout the book, there are those moments when we can speak up, when we can show the power of having courageous conversations. But often your career gets killed off very early on, and you don't have the impact and the ability to make a huge difference as you have done. So it's a fine line, and we'll come back to talk about that later on. I wanted to talk about, you've talked about wives, children, and we talked about a bit about workaholism. I found with coming up now to this episode 391, almost 400 people. The really high achieving men and women have had trauma, turmoil, that would cause them to go towards or away from certain situations. It drives them on to prove something, whether it be to those bullies who pushed you into the locker and locked you up in your first day of school because of the fact that you were a person of color. Whatever it might be, there's some determination to prove the bastards wrong. I am neurodiverse, and therefore being told I was thick and I was going to become a dustman because I couldn't spell and do my math. I was determined, hence becoming a visiting professor at Cass Business School and teaching on the exec MBA, was to try and show them I wasn't stupid. So I don't know whether you found that with other inspiring leaders or leaders you've met, that we are very driven, quite obsessive, to make a mark, to add value, to make a difference. What's your thoughts?
Well, that's definitely the case. We're all a bit alpha, and as my wife says, you're a lot more red than you think you are. If you'll understand all the personality profiling. Red, blue, yellow, green. Yellow, sociable; green, compassionate; blue, interested in process and detail; and red, being alpha and quite assertive. And of course, there is a fine line between all of those qualities are great strengths in moderation, and the alpha, particularly, is a great weakness in excess. And a lot of senior leaders suffer from that. They're the people who become bullies, become very myopic, become very interested in their own opinions, don't listen to any other kind of advice. That's the worst scale of it. But you need a certain amount of it in order to succeed at that level, because you are going to come up against some terrible people, some terrible obstacles, some terrible situations, and you are not going to be able to cope with that if you don't have. In other words, it would be fantastic to be well balanced in all four quadrants. If you ever get that result in a personality profile, that person ought to be the president of the United States, not the one we picked. So,
in fact, you were making me think. I could almost imagine, God sitting there with test tubes and he's adding bits in, and oh no, too much. My God, Trump. Oh no, Boris. Oh no, I made too much of that. A little bit, just a little bit more. Okay, got it about right.
I'm not a religious man, but I'm worried that God was sitting there throwing dice. So, given some of the people you and I will have met, but the ones you respect are the people who understand balance and who understand what it takes, but also what it took to get there wasn't just down to them. It was down to, I'm a classic case in point. I stood on the shoulders of literally thousands of people. My last command was 10,000 people. But the number of people I will have worked with over 30 years in policing at all ranks from PC, and I talk about the 28 great allies who helped me get through my career, all of whom had three things in common: power over me, the fact that they were white, but the fact that they all gave me a kick up the arse when I needed it most. They were on my side and recognised that I could do more and I could be better. And those people were incredibly important. Now, some of those people retired as police constables, having pounded the beat for 30 years. And some of them were commissioners. I mean, it's the individual that counts, but all of them had a grit to them. All of them had enough in the red, enough in the alpha, enough in the assertive to be able to turn around to me, a little bit alpha myself, and put me in my place. And that we all need people like that in our corner.
I think we do, and it really resonates strongly with me. This idea, Arnold Schwarzenegger spoke about this, and they went, "Oh, you're an amazing self-made man from Austria," and all this kind of stuff. And he goes, "No, I'm not a self-made man. I stand on the shoulders of giants, men and women, who've made me who I am." And I think leaders listening to this, please, if I just ask you, never underestimate the shadow you cast. Make sure it's a positive one, not a negative one, because people are learning you. They're learning how you behave, not the fine words you utter, which the rhetoric often doesn't match the reality, but they're watching what you do. And I think if we just remember that we can positively touch the lives of a lot of people, being mentors, coaches, a kind word, a thought, an observation, noticing somebody, writing a personal note. A lot of leaders forget the power of just a handwritten note in the age of the internet and AI that someone has on their mantelpiece. There was one with the Indian connection. One friend of mine who has a lot of people who work for his organization in India. And when they have prizes awarded to the hardest working and the most successful members of their team, they actually call in the parents and the relations of the person, and they give them the award for their son or daughter. And do you know what? It's the best retention tool ever, because when the son says to the mum, "Oh, I'm thinking of leaving this firm," they went, "There's no way. On my mantelpiece, I have got this award for you working for that firm."
That is such an utterly brilliant idea. I wish we always used to say at commendation ceremonies, the medals for you, mum, dad, brother, sister, wife, husband, whoever was in the audience. We always used to say the medals for you. We never gave it to them. We should have done.
No.
We absolutely should have. And I used to write that handwritten note. I used to have my favourite poem by Ralph Waldo Emerson, Definition of a Successful Life. I had it printed on cards, like Hallmark cards.
Oh, what is the quote? What is the definition of a successful life?
Well, it's I can't do it off the top. I used to be able to do it off the top of my head. But,
roughly.
It's to know that even one life has breathed easier because you have lived. That's the last line of the poem. And it's a very short poem. And I used to have it on this card, and I used to write a little note saying thank you for your service and thank you for your amazing bravery or dedication or what you've done. And I didn't really, it was just important to me that they got something that wasn't an email. And years later, I still get people coming up to me who I don't know, obviously, because sometimes I've read about them in dispatches, as you might say, in the military. And I've just written to them, and I've never actually physically met them. And then they'll bump into them in the most bizarre places, and they'll say, "Thank you for the letter you wrote." My son was at school with the son of somebody who'd received one of those letters. And he told his son, "Could you just tell your mate to tell his dad thank you very much for the note," which was incredibly heartwarming. And so you're absolutely right. Those things are, in some respects, more important than the medals and the gongs and the.
Correct.
Correct. Just to say thank you is one of the most important leadership qualities that you can ever have. I mean, and it's so quick, simple, costs nothing, in a little bit of time, and. We should do more. Thank you for mentioning Schwarzenegger. It got edited from my book, but Schwarzenegger is my great hero. And when I was locked in that locker at 11 years old,
because you worked out quite hard, didn't you?
Well, I got my nan to buy me a set of weights at 11 years old. He didn't start weightlifting until he was 15. I started at 11. And I saw him on the front cover of Muscle and Fitness magazine advertising Conan the Barbarian and thought, I want to look like that. And I never did, obviously, but to this day, I'm still using the same weightlifting program that Arnold Schwarzenegger taught me in. It would have been 1981, I think it was.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
Two
I did
years
this
after
morning.
started lifting
I did
weights.
the Arnold press. How about the Arnold press,
The
where you
Arnold
begin
press.
here with the dumbbells and you go up to that and then back? Yeah,
I was in my gym this morning doing exactly the same thing, Jonathan.
yeah.
There you
Well,
go.
there we are.
And
You
what I
see?
like most about Schwarzenegger, because people laugh when you say he is so much more than the man you see. And I think that's an important point. For all of us with a protected characteristic, he is so much more than the man you think he is. And obviously, you know, from bodybuilder to actor to governor, to author to to a charity philanthropist, you know, what that guy has done with his life is a great example of how you can be so much more than the way people perceive you to be. And that's a great role. That's a lesson in life for all of us, I think.
I
And I
think it
went to
is.
see him at the South Bank, and he was just as charismatic in person as he is, you know, on the screen.
Well, and talk about charismatic people and also very modest people. You're married to a very interesting lady called Nina Cope, who was once your boss.
Dr. Nina Cope, yes.
Dr. Nina Cope, and you had to wait until she'd resigned from the police, and then she invited you out, and now you're happily married. And I've had the pleasure of working with her very briefly, but deep respect for her. Tell us about her qualities as an inspired leader, because she is very humble. I can't even get her on the podcast because she's so modest.
No,
but tell us
she
about
wouldn't
it,
do a podcast.
She won't come on a podcast.
She always tells me how she doesn't want any. She's a very private person, and she doesn't want any of that. And then if you Google her, you understand that she's all over the place, leading, you know, women's events, being an inspiring female leader. World Women's Day. She's a speaker at various events and stuff. She's one of those role models, particularly for up-and-coming junior female leaders and the daughters of so many of our friends who just think, I want to be like her. And when I met her, she's an expert in organizational transformation. So if you want your organization to work better, you ought to have her. And thank God she's in the Ministry of Defence now. So at the most important time for our country, how amazing. I feel reassured as a citizen, let alone as a husband.
She's the chief operating officer, isn't she?
For
the MOD?
Yeah. And she has lots of other different jobs, but her major job is to work as the second in command at Defence Equipment and Supply and make sure that we are correctly arming ourselves for a very, very uncertain future. So, but, you know, she's done incredible projects she spent 15 years in law enforcement. She got her CB for services to both diversity as a senior female leader and what she's done for women and people of colour, and what she's done for law enforcement, where she is a published criminologist who wrote a chapter on intelligence-led policing that is still taught today, 20 years later, on criminology courses when we were still sticking pins in maps. And if you read it today, a lot of police officers, particularly detectives, would look at it and go, well, I know all of that. It says, you do now. There's a reason why you know it now. And that person is Dr. Nina Cope. She's incredible. And when she first met me as my boss at the time, Commissioner Paul Stevenson, said, that guy's brilliant at risk. He's a hell of a cop, but his personal life is a tragedy. He's a mess. And Nina's always considered me her greatest transformation project, although she would be quick to remind you, I am still a work in progress. Which is her favourite expression.
Yeah,
that's as much as I can say about her. She will get very upset that I've said that much about her, but she is an extraordinary person.
I deliberately drew you out, and you didn't know that was coming. So nice to talk about that. Talking about
I'm definitely going to blame you.
I know you can do. I'll take full responsibility, and I'll be on the run. And to keep a low profile if she's coming to look for me. But the other person we need to both speak about is a mutual friend of ours who I had the honour of coaching many years ago, was the Assistant Commissioner Bob Quick. Tell us about Bob and why he is the copper's copper and a very inspiring leader, even though Boris also tried to make his life as miserable as possible for his wife and his family and all the journalists that hounded them. But
Bob also did my job before I did. So when I was a detective superintendent, Bob was Assistant Commissioner Specialist Operations, having been the National Head of Counter-Terrorism, having been the Chief Constable of Surrey. And I remember him arriving on the management board because I was, at that time, working in Ian Blair's, the Commissioner's office, as Paul Stevenson, the Deputy Staff Officer. And I watched Bob Quick arrive on that management board. as a former chief constable and just deliver the kind of gravitas and deep thinking and that had been missing. I'm not sure whether Ian Blair would agree with me, but a lot of people on Ian Blair's management board were thinking more about themselves than the organisation. Bob Quick was not one of those people. And of course, he is a South London detective made good. So when I first met him, I was a young sergeant on the Lawrence Inquiry, and he was a detective superintendent, I think relatively newly promoted. But of course, he was given the poison chalice in some respects by Lord Condon, then Sir Paul Condon, who was the commissioner, and Dennis O'Connor and John Grieve, all these amazing senior leaders at the top of the Metropolitan Police saying, you're about to be called institutionally racist. You are going to have to do something about that. I need you to find out why we're going to be called that and what we're going to do about it. You know, are we going to resist it? Are we going to agree with it? Are we going to do something about it? What are we going to say that our journey has been? And he was in charge of just six of us, who were doing that piece of work for the management board at the time. And on the day William Macpherson wrote his damning report and published it, the Macpherson Inquiry, which was a sea change in diversity, not just in the Metropolitan Police, but in policing and the whole of society. His recommendations weren't just for policing, they were for society. It was the turning point, I think, in race relations and race equality in this country. It was a proper watershed moment. Bob Quick was responsible for writing Lord Condon's response in the Daily Telegraph the next day. And I'm sure BQ wouldn't mind me saying that we took his first draft because he was busy studying for an MBA, and I think he was being coached by one Jonathan Bowman-Perks. Dave and I, the two detective sergeants in the office, read it and said, Bob, you're a South London detective. This sounds like a professor from Harvard. We're going to have to make it a bit more. And I know it's coming from Paul Condon, but who is, is a very well-spoken and very intelligent graduate himself. But it has to sound different. And it was Dave and I who took the raw material and made it the letter that you can still Google and find now on there. But it wasn't enough. And when so I can talk about the Lawrence Inquiry all day long, but BQ's influence on me as a person who gave two very young detective sergeants the time of day when most people wouldn't look twice at us. You'd be lucky if you got an audience with an inspector, let alone with a very, very celebrated detective superintendent. He went on to run CIB3, the Ghost Squad, the anti-corruption squad that Paul Condon set up, targeting the 200 most dangerous and corrupt detectives in the. And a couple of years later, he rang up a mutual friend and said, I'd like Neil Basu to come and work for me in CIB3, and gave me the job of running surveillance against those corrupt cops at a time when, I'm known as the only surveillance detective inspector in history with no sense of direction. So it was a weird job to give somebody who was not surveillance trained at the time and didn't know, but he had faith in the work I had done for him and wanted to. And I've known that with people like that, he is one of my 28 great allies. I've no doubt that over the course of my career, Bob Quick has been in the background whispering to people that I was worth taking a chance on. So I owe him a great deal. He is one of those allies who recognised people for their merit as well as their difference.
And that is so interesting, because I do remember your name from the time we worked together, he and I, for a year, and how much he respected you. So that's rather nice. Talking of people you respect.
That's incredible. Thank you for saying that.
Talking of people you respect, you, like me, are a royalist, and you've had the chance of meeting members of the royal family too. You spoke in your book of meeting Prince William, of meeting Prince Charles before he became the King Charles, and also meeting Camilla. Just tell us a little bit about their presence and what you've noticed about them, which is relevant for all of us. We could pick up some of the qualities that they have. What did you admire about meeting them?
You'll know that it's a tremendous breach of protocol to talk about meeting a member of the royal family and what you talked about. And I thought, I have to be honest, I thought, sod that. I think people read what they read in the papers and what journalists say and how people are presented, and form opinions having never actually met or had a conversation with the people they're being so opinionated about. I think that's so wrong. And I think it would be useful for people to know that somebody who's in charge of their country as head of state, and let's be honest, has tremendous worldwide global and political influence as the head of state, is fundamentally an incredibly decent, compassionate human being with a great intellect and a fantastic ability to make, I mean, I wasn't a junior officer when I met him. I was a deputy assistant commissioner, but he had the ability to make me feel like I was his only subject, not one of his subjects. And because he was the Prince of Wales then, and I remember him answering the door himself. I was expecting, and I'd been speaking with his equerry, who is an ex-police officer. The Earl of Rosslyn is Peter Loughborough, who is an old colleague of mine at the Metropolitan Police, who is his right-hand man. And we were laughing as I went, because he could see I was incredibly nervous. He said, "Oh, don't worry," because I was actually up there I thought, to be told off for removing his protection officer. And he said, "Don't worry, it'll be 5 minutes. Just bow, say hello. You'll have a cup of tea, and we'll get you away into your plane in 15 minutes." An hour and a quarter later, I left his office.
Wow.
He wanted to talk about terrorism and extremism and how he could help. I mean, with his connections in the Middle East, and he was tremendous. And I walked away thinking, that is not. And I'd met him for a couple of seconds in a lineup 10 years before when I was a DCI on Trident, where he had done the practiced royal thing of shaking your hand, asking you a decent question. He asked me whether I really thought that what children were seeing and experiencing on TV and in the movies was Mary Whitehouse right, was his basic. And I looked at him and said, with everything I've seen now in my 16, 17-year career up to that point, I think she was. So, and he went, "I knew it." And then he walked off. And I thought, I don't think my editors let that one make the book, but it was the first time I just watched somebody who can make you feel good about, the job you do and who you are in a split second, and not make you feel like your hand is being dropped as you walk up, if that makes sense.
No, that is it. And when I talk to people about developing gravitas and presence as a CEO, I still remember my 90 seconds with Her Majesty the Queen when I got my award, and then also meeting Princess Diana at one of the regimental gatherings. And on both occasions, their time with me was minuscule, but the impact has lasted years.
Yeah.
And it's not just a sort of schoolboy crush on meeting a member of the royal family. It's the fact that the Queen was genuinely interested, and without any notes, she knew about why I was receiving my MBE and was able to have a really deep conversation very quickly. Wow. And that ability to really make you feel like you're the only person in the room that matters, that's a real skill of an inspiring leader. And part of the problem
it's funny you should say that, because when I went to get the QPM, my family, my mother and my Nina and the kids were in the audience watching. And when I went up to get my award, I had promised him up at Burke Hall that I would not leave him. He said, "Right, you're now the DAC, you're now in charge of me and my family's protection. Don't leave." And of course, a year later, I become the senior national coordinator working with MI5 on counter-terrorism operations, and I've left him. And that is when I'm getting my medal. So I go up to get my medal, and he looks at me and he goes, "I told you not to leave me," and then tells me off. And so when I get back to my family, my eldest son Jamie's looked at me and went, "Get a room. Everyone else had like 30 seconds, and you have 2 minutes. What's that about?" I said, "Well, he was telling me off, Jamie." But the fact that he remembered and was funny enough to make a joke of it and congratulated me on my new job and how important that, and knew what that job was. I've got experienced crime correspondents who don't understand what that job is. I've got Prince Charles standing there who knows exactly, now King Charles III, who knows exactly what that job is. Yeah, it's little moments like that make you realise these people, I know the gravitas of their positions mean you're automatically going to be. You and I have met a lot of very celebrated, very famous people, not all of whom will have impressed us, but he did. I have I've been lucky enough to meet Princess Anne, Prince William, Prince Harry, who with all the stuff that is written about Prince Harry now, I can tell you an amazing story about how he made a 40-year serving crime scene sergeant who has, from the Hyde Park bombings to the Sri Lanka Easter Day bombings, has seen some of the most awful things in the world, cry.
What did he do?
Nobody's never. He came to open a mental health conference for me at the counter-terrorism command. He was supposed to stay 5 minutes. He was supposed to be introduced by me and then say 2 words then get off the stage and be rushed away by his team. And my head of protection at the time, Adrian Usher, said, I've asked if he wouldn't mind coming to speak to the guys who just got back from the Sri Lanka bombings who were at this conference, and whether he said he's willing to go and meet them. So I thought he was just going to go and shake their hands and do the usual 2-minute lineup. He sat down with them, and 45 minutes later he left. And they were all kind of like, they couldn't believe what an amazing human being he was. And then I have to read all of this crap written about him every day. You know, I've investigated the people who threatened to kill him and his wife. I've stood by him when we have not stood by him with the protection issues. And I have to read all of this nonsense and hear friends and relatives, you know, reading the newspapers and then being very opinionated about someone they don't know. Well, I like to think I know him a little bit better than that. And he's a hell of a human being. And I want
should
people
get the
to
protection.
understand that.
He should get the protection, shouldn't he?
He absolutely should.
Because he really is he's under threat, isn't he? He's under threat.
Yeah, whatever you think about him, at the end of the day, he was born into a family that wasn't his choice, and he's one of the most recognisable men on the planet who has a genuine threat and risk. I mean, what people don't realise about the judgment, he was never going to win the judgment, the judicial review against Ravek's decision. I wrote the terms of reference for Ravek. It's written ambiguously, and they have the power to do what they want in terms of discretion at ministerial authority. He was never going to win that as a legal argument, but as a moral argument, should he be protected? Of course he should. Of course he should.
No, very, very special guy, and I have a lot of respect for him.
And a quick shout out for Princess Anne, the hardest working royal I've ever met in my life.
Yes, yeah.
And just tremendous.
She was Colonel. She was Colonel Commandant of the Royal Signals, and did so much behind the scenes. Very modest, very hardworking. Yeah.
She used to run my protection teams, all of whom would have been 30 years younger than her. Absolutely ragged. Which is an incredible person. So some members of the royal family, we won't talk about the others, are the reason you and I are royalists. Let's be honest.
Yeah,
and have that leadership gravitas that you were describing. That is sometimes very, very. It's in some respects very difficult to teach. There is a little bit of nature versus nurture. Some people are just capable of giving you that extra lift that you need in a leadership position, and they are definitely a couple of those names are definitely capable of doing that.
No, definitely. And you spoke about the officers who'd seen the horrors in Sri Lanka. You yourself have seen many horrors, and you've met the people afterwards who were impacted by the consequences of many terrorist attacks, such as the Fishmongers' Hall in London and the Manchester Arena bombing, the pop concert. What is the thing that stays with you from all those faces and names and those terrible events that you've been involved in, and the parents you've had to speak to and the relations you've had to speak to? Because it will have had a huge impact on you.
It does, and your listeners won't be able to see this, obviously, but people who might see the podcast is sitting next to Bobby Bear up there is a peace bear knitted by a woman called Fegan Murray, and Fegan Murray is the bereaved mother of Martin Hett, one of the 22 victims of the Manchester Arena bombing. And Fegan, to help manage her grief, learned more than I've ever learned about counter-terrorism, and now lectures worldwide on how to treat victims and what she has learned about terrorism and extremism. And what sticks with me the most is always the victims and the people they've left behind, and how we need to be better at our jobs to stop there ever being any such victims or bereaved families ever again. And this is a melodramatic thing to say, but I'll never forget it. So sitting in the Old Bailey next to somebody who's been shot in the face by a battlefield weapon and survived is, as an innocent member of the public, enjoying their time on a beach in Tunisia, is one of the most raw and emotional experiences I've ever had in my life. And I've hugged the mothers of dead children. And and I've done a lot of that in my career. I made my name in sort of gangland crime, dealing with the murders of young black men by other black men in the drug-fueled sort of 90s and noughties. And their mothers, the wail of their mothers is something you never forget. They call it keening. You know, it is a sound only mothers make. You know, it's an awful thing.
Yeah.
And when I retired, I had a lot of help when I retired, because all I could, I've said this many times publicly, but my job description when I was the head of counter-terrorism operations was to work with MI5 and stop terrorist attacks. And in
Yeah.
2017, 36 people are murdered on my watch. By the time I retired as the head of counter-terrorism, 42 innocent people are dead, and over 1,000 people are physically and mentally scarred for life. And that sticks with you. And I used to have a terrible dream, like a roller coaster. I was young enough to remember those very old-fashioned rickety roller coasters where, like a ghost train, it would suddenly go pitch black, and then images would appear in front of you, and there'd be kind of horrible, ghoulish masks and faces and stuff. I had exactly the same experience, but what I saw was the pictures of terrorist victims, murder victims, and it was it's just absolute. People would call it post-traumatic stress. I've had all of the examinations and stuff. I don't suffer from PTSD, thank God. I wasn't having a nervous breakdown, thank God. I don't fit any of the description of clinical depression, but I sort of know what the journey feels like. And I think I retired in time not to have gone off the edge. That's how you feel, because you feel utterly responsible for the innocent people whose lives have been changed forever, forever.
I just want to thank you for your service to the country, and there will always be consequences of seeing so much trauma and helping so many people, and you become a lightning rod as the police officer for a lot of people's pent-up feelings and emotions and anger.
We take that as part of the job. You're right. We're public servants.
But
we're the public face of a machine that is largely secret. So in the terrorism world, we're the people. Mark Rowley did it before me. Crest did it before him. Bob Quick did it before John Yates. There's a whole series of people who've had to stand up in full uniform with their medals and their hat and take the brickbats of the politicians and the press and the criticism. And we do that on behalf of that national security community because we're paid to do that. And we understand that. But my God, it can hurt at times.
Yeah. And you don't forget it, and you can't shake it off. It's part of who you are. And this, I think, is one of the great skills of a leader, is to have empathy without living with someone else's trauma inside you all the time. Otherwise, it would just literally break you, the number of people you're dealing with.
This is where I hope you're not asking for any advice, because I do lecture on that subject of where that resilience comes from. It was Cress, when I was trying to get a commander's job in the Met, who was sitting on my promotion board, who at the end of the interview said the only intelligent question I've ever been asked at a leadership board, which was, what makes you think you're resilient enough to be a chief officer? And I said, well, you've known me for 20 years. And I described my career and all the really difficult things I'd done in policing. And this was long before, I went from Commander South East London to head of armed policing, and then into organised crime, and then into counter-terrorism. So I was at the start of my executive journey in those big commands. And she just looked at me and smiled. Everyone else is nodding furiously, and she knew I'd missed the point. So what makes you think you're resilient enough to cope with the pressure and the drive, everything I've just described to you? And of course, I, as this, incredibly sort of ambitious and I thought resilient detective chief superintendent who'd seen everything and could cope with everything, I thought, I'll have no problem at all. 10 years later, she was absolutely right. And, she will say right at the end, she was trying to protect me from myself, in terms of, you've done enough, you need a break. And, in many respects, I think, I didn't appreciate it at the time. I'm still not sure that was entirely right. But, when I reflect on those nightmares and the sleepless nights and my medical condition at the time I retired, I kind of think, maybe she was exercising the greatest duty of a leader, which was looking after the people who work for her.
Correct. And little was she to know that you were going to have this period of time when there were so many terrorist attacks in the UK. You've dealt with things like the whole Stephen Lawrence inquiry, Mark Duggan, gangland guy who was shot during by the team with Trident team, Azelle Rodney. You had the riots. You had Salisbury, Sherbet Skripal being poisoned. You had Wayne Couzens and the Everard inquiry, David Carrick, dealing with Boris. who's a complete sort of liability in his own way. I mean, you've had to deal with so many different things, each of which we could spend time on. But sadly, we're coming towards the end of our time. But the thing I take away from you is you have been incredibly resilient, and it's come at a cost. Everything is possible if you're prepared to pay the price and live with the consequences. And sometimes the price and the consequences are very high. Families, divorces, the forces, a lot of people, special forces, their first marriage and their second marriage often doesn't survive. One of the guys said he'd got a 21-year-old daughter, and of her 21 years, he was away for 19 of those years on operations. Hardly knew her at all. And you talked about this as well. What's your thought before we move on to top tips? What's your sort of final look back at this career and the leadership lesson, perhaps, if there's one leadership lesson you'll take from it all?
Well, I sort of worried that certainly when Nina met me, I didn't have coping mechanisms. All the coping mechanisms I had were the wrong ones. We sort of joke about it, but when I was a young constable, our federation representative was off to the Blackpool conference, and he said there'll only be two busy stalls at the conference. One will be AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, and the other one will be Relate. And I thought he was joking, so I laughed, and I looked at his face and said, "I'm not joking, sir." And he was, I had another 29 years of my career to go, and he was right. And it's easy to blame the job for the effect it has on you. You have agency in this. So I think my top tip is, you said it right at the start, don't go into a job that is so brutal and tough, blind, but go in with some coping mechanisms. Go in with some ability to cope with what you're going to face. And we have just started. I sit on the board of a charity called Fleece Care UK, and a great friend of mine who used to be our research director, Dr. Jess Miller, wrote a brilliant book called The Policing Mind. It is about teaching people resilience for the trauma they're about to suffer, to give them some preventative tools to cope with what they're going to cope with. And everyone could do with that, from chief constable to constable. Anyone who serves in the military will recognize it. There's a lot of work being done in the area of trauma and complex post-traumatic stress disorder. What you don't want to do is drink, smoke yourself half to death, as I did, and leave your family. What you want to do is be able to be resilient enough to cope with all of that and still thrive in your personal life as well as your professional life. And I always talk about, I talk about family, friends, fitness, and for those, I'm not a religious person, but faith being incredibly important things. I forgot all of those things while I was concentrating on trying to be the best possible cop I could. That's an incredible mistake. The one thing that kept me going was focus. So again, we started with why. And my focus was, I understood that I was here to help people at the very worst times of their lives, perfect strangers who couldn't help themselves. That was my job to do that, regardless of the consequences for me. And that mission is still the most important mission. So that keeps you going, if you remember that.
And I think it's going to be really good with the Crime Agents, the podcast, because you'll be able to continue to share some wisdom and some experience. And I do think family, friends, fitness, faith, and focus is a really helpful way of people coping without going off the rails with alcohol, drugs, sex, breakup of marriage. So now we're in the last moment or two of the podcast. Would you kindly say who you are, a little bit about your career, the book that we're talking about, Turmoil, which I hold up now for the audience, and then your top leadership tip. And that would be a nice way to end this second podcast.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. So my name's Neil Basu. I'm a Queen's Police Medal holder because I served 30 years in the Metropolitan Police Service, and I finished my career as the Assistant Commissioner, Specialist Operations, which was the National Head of Counter-Terrorism Policing. And I did that. I'm the only police officer. I was the first Asian to hold that job, and I'm the only police officer ever to have held the three most senior roles in counter-terrorism consecutively through what was the busiest period of terrorism in the UK's history since the height of the Troubles in the IRA, so for around 40 years. And I didn't say that, the head of MI5 said that. So, and I made my career as a career detective. I worked on anti-corruption, homicide, gangs and organised crime, and then latterly in my career in counter-terrorism. So I like to call myself a career detective. And my very final job is I went to the College of Policing as a non-executive director on the College of Policing board. I was their strategic advisor on leadership and international development, and I led the 2021 Strategic Command course for 51 very senior public sector leaders to teach them a little bit about leadership, Jonathan. And I hope I did my job. And then I retired, and now I wrote the book in order to exercise some of the demons you've let me talk about on this, but largely, as I described at the start, to prove to policing that I love it, and that it can be better. And if it understands the need to be inclusive and to understand that, it polices for everyone, not just the people it likes. And if it wants the trust and confidence of every community for the intelligence it needs, for the witnesses it needs to do its day job, there is very much a business case for understanding diversity, equality, and inclusion, not just a moral case. I've got rather tired in my late 50s of trying to teach people the morality of treating everyone as a human being. So I would say there is a business case for being a more effective policing service if you get it. And lastly, that people will understand a little bit about what we are like as human beings, not just as uniform or detectives with a badge. The authoritarian nature of what we do makes it sometimes difficult for people to understand that we are just like them. And Peel was absolutely right. The police are the public and the public are the police. We may not have always got that right, but at the end, we are just normal members of the public doing extraordinary things on your behalf. And we should thank the people who are still out there every day doing it.
Well, thank you. And your top tip around speaking the truth to power. Do you want to just say a bit about why that's a top tip?
Yeah. Well, it's you did let me think about this to start with, and it was on that course I taught at the College of Policing. The day that caused the most anxiety is the day where we talk about truth to power. Your ability to turn round to somebody in a position of authority who is making either a fundamental mistake or something that crosses one of your red lines as a human being, your values, and tell them the truth. You have got to be able to do that if you want to lead. The idea that it created anxiety in a room full of senior leaders depressed me slightly. I mean, how did you get here? And of course, my great shame is my fit in or F off line. You sometimes have to absorb the culture around you to get to a place where you can make authoritative decisions. But if someone is telling you to do something that crosses a red line that is illegal or unethical, then it should be very easy for you to say, I'm not doing that. Just following orders is a Nuremberg principle. We had an entire regime in the 30s, the most destructive in human history, where people just followed orders. Don't follow orders. If you want to be a leader, you set the tone, you set the orders, you don't just follow them. If you can't do that, then really the honourable thing to do is to leave. And, you need to learn that lesson early on in your career and make sure that you understand what your values are, because eventually they will be tested by somebody above you.
Well, Neil, that's really well said, and a great bit of wisdom about speaking truth to power. And thank you for your 30 years service, and thank you for continuing to make a real difference, the support you're giving to the Inspiring Leadership Foundation and the victims of violence against women and girls, which I think is close to your heart as it is to Lee and myself. Good luck with your new podcast, The Crime Agents, and thanks again for being on the podcast.
Well, thank you.